Okay, so this is a CR question. If the above statements are true, this is from OG. If the above statements are true, which of the following must also be true about the United States residents who took trips for pleasure in 1997? So this must be an inference kind of thing. Or what can I infer from the above? So transportation expenses accounted for a large portion of the total dollar amount spent on trips by residents of the US in 1997. Transportation expenses accounted for a large portion of the total. So out of $100 spent for a trip, transport accounted for maybe more than at least above 50. How much above 50? We don't know. For pleasure, so not for business or anything. For trips for pleasure, okay. In the year 1997, by about and about half of the total dollars spent amount, and about half of the total dollar amount spent on transportation was airfare. Okay, so in case there are multiple types of trips, so you're taking airfare, then you take maybe a taxi, then maybe an Uber, bus, and about half of the total dollar amount spent on transportation was airfare. Okay, so let's say out of $100 you spent total, that includes hotel, food, etc. $60 was transportation. Out of $60, at least $30 was airfare. Now, airfare by itself does not account for more than 50 in my example. I just wanted to confirm that. It's around 30, and the rest is Uber, taxis, bus, shuttle buses, um, you know. However, okay, now there's a big however. However, the large majority of US residents who took trips for pleasure did not travel by airplane but used other means of transportation. So, what about folks who did not use airfare at all? How is it possible that a large portion of the total dollar amount spent for pleasure accounted for? Well, how is it possible? How is the blue possible for them? In fact, majority of the folks, residents who took trips for pleasure only traveled by car, for example. So either either the total amount is no longer for the folks. So in my example, for the folks who use an airplane, $100 was spent, out of which $60 was transportation, out of and $40 was the rest. Now, out of 60, $30 specifically was airfare, and the rest was maybe car. So $30 airfare. Let me just write it down. Folks who took plane when traveling for pleasure. Total was $100. Transportation, $60, out of which airplane was $30. Others, let's say Uber, taxi, car, $30. So now you're telling me folks however, this is not the case for majority. Most of the folks did not even use did not use airplanes. So how is it possible that your Uber and all of that, how is transportation thus the most expensive chunk? So either two things is going on. Two things. Either increase airplane costs. These folks are using the Uber, taxis, cars to compensate for the $30. Much more than folks in scenario one 1. Scenario 2, folks who don't use much more than folks in scenario A, and thus accounts for $60. So $30 to $30 more, adding to $60. So that's an example, but I don't think so. But I think there's another scenario that's also going through in my head. These folks are that maybe the amount spent on travel totally is no longer $30, sorry, $100, but instead maybe now $70. Hence, transportation is $30 out of $70, which is, I don't know, about 60%, versus transportation scenario 1 is $60 by $100. Total amount, the base amounts, the denominator have shifted. I think one of these two scenarios, that's what's going on in my mind. Most of the folks who traveled by airplane did so because it was lower than the cost of other means. Okay, but that doesn't explain. Maybe this actually, this maybe strengthens, this maybe is not inferential. I'll keep this for now. Most of these who traveled by airplane did so because other means are, okay, that's irrelevant. B, per mile travel, those who travel by tended to spend more on transportation to their destination than who use other modes. This, in fact, is giving me the opposite. I'm looking for something that tells me that other forms of transportation per mile is equal to the amount spent on airlines, which is my scenario number 2. People who do not had lower transportation expenses than people who did. Maybe. Those who traveled by airplane spent about as much on average on other means as they did on airfare. D is the opposite of what I'm looking for. Just not sure. Most of those who travel, so B is irrelevant for sure. Who did not travel had lower average transportation expense. Yeah, that's lower, but then how? But I'm looking for percentages, so that's irrelevant. Those who travel by airplane, but on average, other means of transportation. I said, those who travel by airplane tend to spend more on transportation. I think C is what I'm looking for. C is essentially telling me that the base values are different. I think that's what C is telling me. This is telling me if I'm spending, those who took airlines spend $100, whereas those who did not take airlines only spend $70. You spend more on transportation to their destination. Yeah, that's so the overall, it's no longer $100. Most of those who travel by airplane did so because the airfare was lower than the cost of other means. So if anything, this is telling me that this, I think, strengthens the argument that if I was to have traveled by taxi to my destination, my transportation expenses will go higher actually. Maybe also A versus C. Those who travel by airplane spent about as much on average on other means of transportation as they did on airfare. So this weakens because this is telling me those who travel by airplane spent about as much on average on other means of transportation. Many of those who travel by airplane did so because the air. I, I think this strengthens this. Those who travel. This also, I think, strengthens. C is actually explaining why. C perhaps is an example of explain the paradox. I'll get rid of C for now because that's explaining the paradox. B makes it B makes it actually strange because if B is true, then actually people who don't take airlines would probably spend more as a percentage. This would tell me that people who took airlines maybe spent 60%. This would tell me the folks who are taking airlines spend 60%, whereas folks who don't take airlines probably spend maybe 75% or something. So I think A is also spent about as much. This tells me that whether you spend on airline versus whether you take a taxi or an Uber, you're spending the same amount on transportation. So E probably I would select E at this point.